A beggar saved a millionaire and asked him to pretend to be his father for a day as a reward. Hours later, the millionaire was shocked to see the boy holding a photo of himself. The streets buzzed with life, but for Ryan, a boy of barely 12, they were an unforgiving battlefield. His small frame was hidden beneath layers of mismatched clothing, tattered and worn from nights spent braving the cold. He darted through alleys, his bare feet nimble as he evaded an angry vendor shouting after him for snatching a loaf of bread. Ryan wasn't a thief by nature. He was a survivor. Days bled into nights of scavenging through dumpsters, hoping for scraps, and dodging trouble at every corner. Despite his hardships, there was a spark in his eyes that hinted at a resilience few could comprehend. Life had given him nothing but challenges, yet he faced each day with a determination that belied his age. His greatest treasure was a small, creased photograph tucked safely in his pocket. Whenever the world felt unbearable, Ryan would pull it out, staring intently at the image of a man in a crisp suit, smiling warmly. He didn't know the man's name, but he held on to the belief that this stranger might one day rescue him from his desolation. His mother, before disappearing from his life, had whispered in his ear, "This man. He's your father. He'll find you when you need him most." The photo was both a comfort and a mystery. It spurred Ryan to endure, giving him a purpose as he navigated the harsh streets. He'd sit by the curbside some evenings, his sharp eyes scanning the crowds in hope of recognizing the man from the picture. Every stranger's face became a fleeting possibility. Ryan had learned the art of blending into the background, watching and waiting. His small shelter, a makeshift tent of tarps and cardboard, was tucked away in an abandoned lot, hidden from prying eyes. Here, he would dream of a better life, clutching the photograph tightly against his chest as though it were a talisman against the darkness of his world. One night, as the city lights dimmed and the streets grew quieter, Ryan stared at the photograph again. "Maybe tomorrow," he whispered, his voice small but filled with unwavering hope. Miles Donovan's life was the epitome of success, at least on the surface. He sat in the back seat of a sleek black limousine, the city lights reflecting off the polished exterior. A man of power, he commanded industries, owned sprawling properties, and wielded influence over boardrooms filled with people who hung on his every word. Yet, as the car wove through the bustling streets, Miles stared blankly out of the tinted window. The suit he wore was tailored to perfection, his wrist adorned with a luxury watch that cost more than most people earned in a year. But the emptiness in his gaze betrayed a deep loneliness that all his wealth could not fill. Miles had built his empire from the ground up, driven by ambition and a hunger to prove his worth. But the pursuit of success had come at a cost. His relationships had crumbled under the weight of his workaholic tendencies. Friends had become distant, lovers had left, and family ties were frayed beyond repair. There was one photograph he avoided looking at, the one tucked away in the top drawer of his office desk. It was a faded picture of a younger version of himself with a woman he had loved once, long ago. She had been the one bright spot in a life otherwise consumed by relentless ambition. Their separation had been abrupt and painful, and the regret lingered like an unhealed wound. The only person who could soften his hardened exterior was his assistant, Grace, who had been with him for over a decade. On this particular evening, she broke the silence in the car. "You've been quiet all day, Mr. Donovan," she said gently, handing him a folder of documents. "Everything all right?" Miles sighed, rubbing his temple. "It's just another day, Grace. Just business as usual." But even as he said it, a pang of discontent stirred in his chest. Despite all his accomplishments, there was a nagging emptiness, a yearning for something he couldn't define. The limousine rolled to a stop outside his opulent penthouse. Miles stepped out, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. He looked up at the towering skyscraper that bore his name and felt a hollow sense of pride. It was all his, yet it felt like nothing. The midday sun beat down on the bustling city as Ryan scanned the crowded streets. His stomach growled in protest. It had been 2 days since his last proper meal. He wandered aimlessly, hoping for a stroke of luck, when the screech of tires and a panicked scream shattered the monotony. Across the street, a man in an expensive suit. His neatly combed hair and commanding presence a stark contrast to the chaos around him, stood frozen. A delivery van careened toward him, the driver struggling to regain control. Ryan didn't hesitate. Without thinking of the consequences, he bolted into the street, his small frame weaving through the crowd. "Look out!" he shouted, shoving the man out of harm's way just as the van skidded to a halt, inches from where they had stood moments before. The man, breathless and shaken, looked down at the scrappy boy who had just saved him. Ryan's wide eyes met his, and for a fleeting moment, Miles Donovan felt something unfamiliar, a vulnerability he hadn't experienced in years. You saved me," Miles said, his voice trembling slightly. Ryan shrugged, brushing dirt off his tattered clothes. "I just did what anyone would have done." "No, you didn't," Miles countered, his business-hardened instincts kicking in. He straightened his suit, regaining composure. "What's your name, kid?" "Ryan," he said simply, shoving his hands into his pockets. He avoided Miles's gaze, already feeling out of place next to the man's commanding presence. Miles reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick wad of cash. "Here, take this. You deserve it." Ryan glanced at the money but shook his head. "I don't want your money." Miles blinked, unaccustomed to refusal. "Then what do you want?" Ryan hesitated. He had spent so many nights clutching that photograph, dreaming of meeting the man in it. And now, standing before someone who could very well be his salvation. His words came out in a rush. "Pretend to be my dad. Just for one day." The request hung in the air, startling Miles into silence. It was the last thing he had expected, and yet something in the boy's tone, earnest and tinged with longing, made him hesitate. "Just one day," Ryan repeated softly, his voice almost a plea. Miles Donovan stood motionless, grappling with the boy's strange request. "Pretend to be your father," he echoed, his voice laced with disbelief. Ryan nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Just for one day. That's all I want." Miles studied the boy more closely now. The worn clothes, the hollow cheeks, the guarded eyes that betrayed a lifetime of hardship. He opened his mouth to refuse, instinctively ready to distance himself from the emotional entanglement. But then, he saw the flicker of desperation beneath Ryan's bravado, and something within him faltered. "Why me?" Miles asked finally, his tone softer. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. "You look like someone I know," he muttered, avoiding Miles's piercing gaze. "Someone important." The cryptic answer only deepened Miles's curiosity. The logical part of his mind screamed at him to walk away. But the image of this boy darting into traffic to save him was still fresh in his mind, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt an inexplicable obligation to say yes. "Fine," Miles said at last, his words careful. "One day. That's it." Ryan's face lit up with a smile so radiant it caught Miles off guard. "Really?" Ryan asked, as though he hadn't expected the millionaire to agree. "Yes," Miles replied, already questioning his decision. "But there are rules. This is a one-time thing, and you'll tell me exactly what you want out of this arrangement." Ryan nodded enthusiastically. I just want to spend time together like a real father and son." Miles sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. This was madness. He was Miles Donovan, a man with a packed schedule and no time for personal entanglements. Yet here he was, standing in the middle of a crowded street, agreeing to an absurd request from a boy he didn't know. "Where do we start?" Miles asked reluctantly. Ryan grinned, his earlier wariness replaced by a spark of excitement. "Follow me. I'll show you." Miles followed as Ryan led him down the street, weaving through alleys and past bustling markets. For the first time in years, Miles felt something stir in his chest, a faint but undeniable sense of curiosity about what lay ahead. Miles Donovan found himself in unfamiliar territory, trailing Ryan through the narrow, bustling streets of a neighborhood far removed from his luxurious penthouse. The sights and smells assaulted his senses. Sizzling food carts, shouting vendors, and the occasional stray dog darting between the crowd. He tugged at his pristine suit, feeling entirely out of place. "Where are we going?" Miles asked, stepping over a puddle that threatened to ruin his polished leather shoes. "You'll see," Ryan said with a sly grin, weaving ahead with the agility of someone accustomed to the chaos of the streets. "We've got a whole day. You've got to see my world." Miles raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He felt a mix of annoyance and intrigue as he followed the boy. His assistant, Grace, had called twice, but he ignored her. Whatever this day was going to be, it had already consumed his attention. Their first stop was a tiny park squeezed between two towering apartment buildings. The swing set was rusted, the slide dented, but Ryan ran to it like it was Disneyland. "This was my mom's favorite spot," Ryan said, his tone softer now. He plopped onto a bench, patting the empty space beside him. Miles hesitated before sitting, his tailored suit awkward against the rough wooden bench. "Your mother?" he asked cautiously. Ryan nodded, his gaze fixed on a group of kids playing tag. "She used to bring me here before things got bad." He paused, then quickly changed the subject. "Anyway, what do dads and sons even do?" "I've never had one." Miles blinked, caught off guard. "I wouldn't know," he admitted. "I wasn't exactly father of the year material." "Good," Ryan said with a grin. "Then we can figure it out together." From the park, they moved to a dilapidated shelter where Ryan spent his nights. He showed Miles his stash of scavenged treasures, small trinkets, a torn comic book, and a box of crayons. Miles listened, surprisingly captivated by the boy's stories about how he found each item. As the day unfolded, the awkwardness between them began to fade. Miles started to see Ryan's world not as a burden, but as a window into a life of resilience and grit, a life that was worlds apart from his own. As the day wore on, Miles found himself drawn deeper into Ryan's world. After leaving the park and the makeshift shelter, they wandered aimlessly, stopping at street vendors for snacks and chatting about inconsequential things. It felt surreal to Miles, this strange, almost fatherly role he was playing. Ryan, for his part, seemed to revel in the attention. He pointed out landmarks from his life: a small alley where he once found a stray puppy, a bakery where the owner occasionally gave him leftovers, and a mural he liked to sit by when he needed to think. At each stop, he shared snippets of his life, tidbits that painted a picture of hardship and ingenuity. But there was one thing Ryan kept close to his chest, a small photograph he frequently checked when he thought Miles wasn't looking. It happened again as they sat on the steps of an old church, resting after hours of walking. Ryan slipped his hand into his pocket, pulled out the photo, and stared at it with a mixture of longing and hope. He quickly tucked it away when Miles turned his head. "What's that?" Miles asked, his curiosity finally getting the better of him. Ryan froze for a second before shrugging. "Nothing. Just a picture." "Of what?" Miles pressed, leaning slightly toward him. Ryan hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the frayed hem of his shirt. "It's someone important," he said cryptically, avoiding Miles's eyes. Miles frowned, sensing there was more to the story. "Let me see it." "No," Ryan said quickly, his tone sharp. Then, seeing Miles's startled expression, he softened. "I mean, not yet. It's private." The boy's protective response piqued Miles's interest even more. He wanted to press further, but something about the way Ryan clutched the photograph, like it was his lifeline, made him hold back. "Now." "All right," Miles said, raising his hands in surrender. "Keep your secrets." Ryan's shoulders relaxed, and he offered a sheepish smile. "Maybe later," he said. "If I trust you." Miles couldn't help but smirk at the boy's audacity. "If you trust me. Isn't this whole day about pretending I'm your father?" "Yeah," Ryan said, a hint of mischief in his eyes. "But trust is earned." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the city in hues of amber and gold, Miles and Ryan found themselves at a small diner tucked away in a quiet corner of the neighborhood. The smell of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air. It was a modest place, but to Ryan, it might as well have been a palace. "I haven't eaten here in a long time," Ryan said, sliding into the booth. He looked out of place in the diner's bright, clean interior, his clothes stained and torn. But his grin was wide, his excitement palpable. Miles studied the boy as they waited for their food. Despite everything, Ryan's energy was infectious. He was chatty now, talking about the people he met on the streets, his favorite spots in the city, and the stray dog he sometimes fed when he had extra scraps. "You're a lot tougher than most kids I know," Miles said after a while. It wasn't a compliment so much as an observation. Ryan shrugged, grabbing a fry from the basket that had just arrived. "You don't get a choice out here," he said matter-of-factly. Then his tone softened. "But sometimes I think about what it'd be like to have a family. A real one." Miles felt a pang of something he couldn't quite identify. Sympathy, perhaps, or maybe guilt. He cleared his throat. "Not all families are perfect, you know. Some of us mess it up pretty badly." "Yeah, but at least you had one," Ryan replied, his voice quiet but steady. "My mom was all I had. And then she wasn't." The admission hung in the air, heavy with unspoken grief. For the first time that day, Ryan seemed smaller, more fragile. Miles wanted to say something, but no words came to mind. Instead, he did something that surprised even himself. He reached across the table and ruffled Ryan's messy hair. Ryan blinked in surprise, then smiled. It was a fleeting moment, but one that softened the invisible wall between them. Later, as they left the diner, Ryan pulled out the photograph again, glancing at it briefly before tucking it away. This time he didn't try to hide it. Miles noticed but said nothing. Their bond was growing, and with it, his curiosity about the boy's secrets. The evening deepened as Miles and Ryan strolled through quieter streets. Streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows over the uneven pavement. Despite their growing rapport, an air of unspoken tension lingered between them. For Miles, it was the persistent curiosity about the photograph. For Ryan, it was the burden of secrets he wasn't ready to share. Miles broke the silence. "You mentioned your mother earlier. What was she like?" Ryan hesitated, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "She was strong," he said finally. "She used to tell me stories, sing me songs. She always said we didn't need much as long as we had each other." "She sounds remarkable," Miles said, glancing down at the boy. "She was." Ryan's voice wavered, and he cleared his throat before continuing. "But things got hard when she got sick. She couldn't work and we had to move around a lot. Then one day she just didn't wake up." Miles stopped in his tracks. "Ryan, I'm sorry." Ryan shrugged, his face carefully blank. "It's okay. She gave me this before she got really sick." He tapped the pocket where the photograph was tucked. "Said it would help me find my dad." Miles's steps faltered. He tried to keep his voice steady as he asked, "And you've been looking for him ever since?" "Not always," Ryan admitted. "At first I didn't know where to start. But when things got really bad I figured maybe I should try. I don't even know if he's still alive." The raw honesty in Ryan's words struck Miles. There was no bitterness, only a quiet determination to cling to the hope his mother had left him. It was both admirable and heartbreaking. "Do you really think the man in that photo is your father?" Miles asked, his curiosity edging into urgency. Ryan gave him a sidelong glance. "Why do you care so much?" Miles hesitated. He couldn't explain why the thought of that photo, its significance to Ryan, unsettled him. "I just do," he said lamely. Ryan smirked, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of trust. "Maybe one day I'll show you. If you're ready for it." The words were teasing, but they carried weight. Miles knew the boy's story was far from over, and the truth was inching closer with every passing moment. The night settled in fully, stars barely visible through the haze of city lights. Miles and Ryan ended their wandering at a small bench near the river, where the distant sound of water lapping against the banks offered a moment of calm. Ryan leaned back, pulling the photograph out again, this time holding it openly in his hands. Miles glanced at it, unable to restrain his curiosity any longer. "That photo," he began, his voice low but insistent. "Let me see it." Ryan hesitated. For a moment, he seemed to debate whether to share this most guarded piece of his life. Finally, he sighed and handed the photograph over. "Fine. Just don't laugh." Miles took the small, worn picture, his fingers brushing against its frayed edges. He turned it toward the light and froze. The image was old but unmistakable. It was a photograph of himself. A much younger version, to be sure, but there was no mistaking the tailored suit, the confident smile, the way he carried himself even in a still frame. He stared at the photo, his breath catching in his throat. This is me," Miles said, his voice barely a whisper. Ryan nodded, as if the revelation was no surprise to him. "Yeah, that's what my mom said. She told me you were my dad." Miles felt the ground tilt beneath him. "But that's impossible," he stammered. "I mean, I don't," he cut himself off, his mind racing back through the years. Faces and names from the past blurred together, but none of them seemed to connect to this boy or his mother. Or did they? Ryan watched him closely, his expression unreadable. "She always said you didn't know about me. That you weren't a bad guy, just not around." Miles's throat tightened. He wanted to deny it outright, but the photograph, this damning piece of evidence, made that impossible. How could this boy have a picture of him that seemed decades old? "Who was your mother?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse. Ryan hesitated, his eyes shimmering with something between hope and fear. "Her name was Anna," he said softly. "Anna Collins." Miles's heart stopped. The name was like a ghost from his past, one he hadn't thought about in years. Miles gripped the photograph tightly, his mind a whirlwind of fragmented memories. Anna Collins. The name brought with it a flood of emotions he had buried long ago: regret, longing, and a sharp pang of guilt. "You knew her, didn't you?" Ryan asked quietly, his gaze locked onto Miles's face. "You knew my mom." Miles swallowed hard, unable to meet the boy's eyes. I knew an Anna Collins once," he admitted, his voice unsteady. "But that was a long time ago. We were close, but things didn't work out." "Close?" Ryan echoed, his voice cracking. "You left her, didn't you?" The accusation hung in the air, sharp and unrelenting. Miles felt it like a punch to the gut. "It wasn't like that," he said defensively, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "We were young. I didn't know she was." He stopped, the weight of his ignorance crashing down on him. "She never told me about you." Ryan's jaw tightened, his small fists clenched at his sides. "She said you didn't know. But she also said you might not care if you did." Miles flinched. The image of Anna, vibrant and full of life, clashed with the picture Ryan painted of a struggling single mother abandoned to fate. Could he have been so blind, so selfish? "I cared about her," Miles said, his voice trembling. "But I was ambitious. Too ambitious. I left to chase success, and by the time I looked back she was gone." "You didn't try to find her," Ryan said bitterly. "No, I didn't," Miles admitted, the shame in his voice undeniable. I thought it was better to move on." Ryan looked away, his expression hard to read. "She never hated you, you know. Even when things got bad, she always said you were a good man. She said you'd be different if you knew." Miles felt as though the ground beneath him was slipping away. He had spent years building an empire, priding himself on control and precision. But this was chaos, and it was his doing. "I'm sorry," Miles said, the words heavy with sincerity. "I didn't know. If I had, would it have changed anything?" Ryan asked sharply, his voice laced with both hope and doubt. Miles stared at the boy, unsure how to answer. Miles sat back on the bench, the photograph still clutched in his hand. The weight of Ryan's question, asterisk, would it have changed anything? Asterisk echoed in his mind. He looked at the boy beside him, a mix of anger and vulnerability etched on his young face, and realized he didn't have an answer. I want to say yes, Miles said finally, his voice low. But I don't know. Then, I wasn't the man I am now. Then who were you? Ryan demanded, his voice sharp with frustration. Someone who just walked away. Someone who didn't care. Miles flinched but forced himself to meet Ryan's eyes. I was someone who thought success was the only thing that mattered. I told myself I was building a future, but I didn't stop to think about who I might be leaving behind. Ryan shook his head, his voice rising. Well, your success didn't help us. We didn't need your money or your big buildings. We needed you. Do you know how many nights I've wondered what I did wrong? Why you didn't want me? The boy's words cut deep, and Miles felt a lump form in his throat. He had faced down hostile boardrooms and ruthless competitors, but nothing had prepared him for this. Ryan, listen to me, he said, leaning forward. I didn't know you existed. If I had. Ryan interrupted, his tone bitter. You didn't know because you didn't care enough to stay. You didn't even look back. The accusation hung in the air, and Miles found he couldn't argue. His silence only seemed to deepen Ryan's frustration. The boy stood, pacing restlessly in front of the bench. What happens now? Ryan finally asked, his voice softer but tinged with weariness. You just go back to your fancy life and I go back to mine. Pretending this day didn't happen. Miles stared at him, a sense of helplessness washing over him. For so long, he had thought of himself as untouchable, a man who controlled his fate. Now, faced with the reality of a son he never knew, he realized just how little he had actually controlled. No, Miles said firmly, rising to his feet. We're not going back to pretending. I don't know how yet, but I'm going to figure this out. You deserve that much and more. Ryan stopped pacing and turned to face Miles, his expression a mixture of skepticism and fragile hope. You mean that? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Miles nodded, the gravity of his decision reflected in his serious gaze. Yes, I do. I don't know if I can make up for all the time we've lost, but I can't walk away from this. From you. The boy's guarded demeanor wavered, and for a moment, he seemed like the child he should have been. Hopeful, yearning, but unsure how to trust. What happens now? He asked cautiously. Miles took a deep breath, his mind already racing with possibilities. We take it one step at a time. First, we figure out the truth about me, about your mom, about everything. If you are my son, I'll make sure you never have to wonder where you belong again. Ryan's eyes widened. You'd really do that, even if it means. I'm not your kid. Miles knelt down so they were eye level, his expression earnest. Ryan, whether or not we're related by blood doesn't change what I owe you. You risked your life for me today. You're brave, resilient, and you've been through more than anyone your age should ever have to face. I don't need a DNA test to know you're worth fighting for. Ryan blinked rapidly, as though trying to keep tears at bay. He scuffed the ground with his worn sneaker. It's not just about me, you know, he said quietly. My mom. She never stopped believing in you. Even when things got bad, she said you were a good man. I didn't want to believe her, but now, I'm starting to think she was right. Miles felt a pang of guilt mixed with gratitude. She sounds like she was an amazing woman. And if there's any chance she was right about me, then I owe it to her. And to you, to be the man she believed in. Ryan hesitated for a long moment, then nodded. Okay, let's try. But don't mess this up. Miles smiled faintly. Deal. As they began to walk back toward the city, a sense of purpose filled Miles for the first time in years. This boy, this chance encounter, had given him something he hadn't realized he was missing. A reason to try again. The following morning, Miles woke with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. His phone buzzed with reminders of meetings and calls, but for once they felt unimportant. He called his assistant, Grace, and explained the situation in brief, leaving out the more personal details. "I need you to find out everything you can about a woman named Anna Collins," he said, pacing the length of his living room. "She lived here in the city about 13 years ago. Start with public records, hospital files, anything." Grace didn't question him, though her tone betrayed her curiosity. "I'll get on it right away, Mr. Donovan." With that task set in motion, Miles turned his attention to Ryan, who was perched on the edge of the couch, watching nervously. The boy had spent the night in one of Miles's guest rooms, a luxury he clearly wasn't used to. Even now, he sat stiffly, as if afraid he might break something by accident. "What happens if we don't find anything?" Ryan asked, fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. Miles sat beside him, resting a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll find something," he said firmly. "And if we don't, then we'll make our own way forward." Later that day, Grace called back with the first pieces of information. "I found a record of Anna Collins," she said. "She lived in a small apartment in the east side of the city about 12 years ago. There's a birth certificate for a Ryan Collins, but no father listed." Miles's heart sank. The omission felt like a confirmation of his worst fears. He really hadn't known. "What else?" he asked, his voice tense. "There's one more thing," Grace said hesitantly. "I found a record of her hospitalization. She was admitted several times before she passed. It looks like complications from an untreated illness." The weight of her words settled over Miles like a stone. He thanked Grace and ended the call, his mind racing. He glanced at Ryan, who sat quietly, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Your mom was brave," Miles said softly. "And I promise we're going to honor her memory by figuring this out together." Ryan nodded, his trust in Miles growing, even as the shadows of the past loomed larger. The days that followed were unlike anything Ryan had ever experienced. He was used to fending for himself, constantly watching his back, and expecting little from anyone. But now, in Miles's world, things were different. Slowly, he began to adapt to a life of stability, though not without moments of hesitation. The first night Miles brought home groceries for dinner, Ryan hovered awkwardly in the kitchen, unsure if he was allowed to help himself. "What do you want to eat?" Miles asked, glancing at the boy as he unpacked bags of fresh produce and meats. Ryan shrugged. "Anything's fine. I'm not picky." Miles frowned, recognizing the defensive tone of someone who wasn't used to having choices. "How about spaghetti? You ever made it from scratch?" Ryan's face lit up, the suggestion catching him off guard. "Oh, is that a thing?" By the time the two of them sat down to eat, the kitchen was a mess. Flour on the counters, sauce splattered on Miles's shirt, and a pile of dishes in the sink. But Ryan was smiling as he twirled his fork through the noodles, his guard dropping bit by bit. As the days passed, Miles started learning just how much Ryan had endured. They talked late into the night, Ryan sharing memories of his mother, from her lullabies to the way she would sketch dreams of a better future in the margins of old newspapers. "She used to draw houses," Ryan said one evening, holding a mug of hot chocolate Miles had made. "Big ones with gardens. She always said she wanted a place where I could play without worrying about the streets." Miles listened quietly, guilt and admiration warring within him. "She sounds like an incredible woman," he said softly. "She never gave up on you." Ryan nodded. "She didn't. And I won't give up on her either. That's why I held on to the photo. So I'd find you. For her." The boy's unwavering faith in his mother's words struck a chord in Miles. He resolved to do more than just investigate the past. He would give Ryan a future his mother had dreamed of. "Stick with me, kid," Miles said with a small smile. "We've got a lot to figure out, but I think we're getting somewhere." Ryan smirked, his trust growing. "Don't mess it up." Days turned into weeks as Miles dug deeper into Anna's past. He used every resource at his disposal: private investigators, hospital records, and old acquaintances who might know something. The more he uncovered, the clearer the picture became, and with it, the heavy weight of realization. One afternoon, Grace arrived at Miles's office, a file folder clutched in her hands. "You'll want to see this," she said, her expression serious. Miles opened the file and froze. Inside were hospital discharge papers bearing Anna's name, alongside medical records documenting her declining health. One document stood out, a letter Anna had written to an adoption agency but never sent. In it, she described her struggle to raise Ryan alone and her hope that his father, Miles Donovan, might one day take responsibility if he ever learned the truth. "She wrote this?" Miles asked, his voice barely audible. Grace nodded. "It looks like she kept hoping you'd come back into her life, but when her health got worse, she didn't know where to find you. The adoption agency confirmed she never finalized the application. She must have changed her mind." Miles leaned back in his chair, his chest tight. He had spent years convincing himself that his past was irrelevant, that he had moved on. But now the evidence was irrefutable. Ryan was his son. That evening, Miles returned home with the file in hand. Ryan was on the couch, flipping through a book Miles had bought him. He looked up, his expression cautious. "What's up?" Miles sat down beside him and handed him the letter. "This is from your mom," he said gently. "It's about me. About us." Ryan read it slowly, his hands trembling slightly. When he finished, he looked up, his eyes wide with emotion. "So, it's true?" he asked. "You're my dad." Miles nodded, his voice thick with emotion. And I'm sorry, Ryan. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you and your mom when you needed me. But I promise I'm here now." Ryan stared at him for a long moment before throwing his arms around him. For the first time, the weight of uncertainty lifted. They were no longer strangers, they were family. The days after the truth came out were unlike anything Ryan had ever known. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of belonging, a fragile but growing certainty that he no longer had to navigate the world alone. Miles wasted no time integrating Ryan into his life. He began by legalizing their bond, reaching out to lawyers to ensure Ryan would never have to return to the streets. "We'll make it official," Miles had said, his tone resolute. "You'll be my son in every way that matters." Ryan, unused to such generosity, had initially been hesitant. "Are you sure?" he'd asked. "I'm not exactly what people think of when they imagine your family." Miles had smiled warmly. "Neither am I. We'll figure it out together." Soon Ryan's life began to change. Miles enrolled him in school, where Ryan nervously walked the halls of a place that didn't feel like survival, but opportunity. The boy's natural sharpness and resilience made him a quick study, and Miles took pride in every report card and every story Ryan brought home. But it wasn't just Ryan who was changing. For Miles, the experience of being a father awakened parts of himself he had long forgotten: kindness, patience, and a sense of responsibility beyond his career. He traded late-night meetings for evenings helping Ryan with homework and weekends exploring the city together. The towering walls of his penthouse began to feel less like an empty fortress and more like a home. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Ryan turned to Miles. "You know, my mom always said that family doesn't have to be perfect. You just have to show up." Miles looked at the boy who had brought light into his life and smiled. "Your mom was a wise woman. And I'm showing up now for good." Ryan grinned, leaning against him. For the first time he felt secure, knowing he didn't have to fight every battle alone. And for Miles, the empire he had built finally felt like it had a purpose beyond wealth. They were no longer two strangers bound by circumstance. They were a family, pieced together by love and the courage to face the past. A month after the revelation, Ryan and Miles stood side by side in a quiet cemetery. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers and damp earth. In Ryan's hand was a bouquet of daisies, his mother's favorite. "She always said daisies were simple but strong," Ryan murmured, placing the bouquet gently at the base of the headstone. "Like her." Miles stood silently, his hands in his pockets as he stared at the grave marker etched with Anna Collins's name. He had rehearsed what he might say if he ever had the chance to visit this spot. Now, faced with the reality, words failed him. "I wish I'd been here sooner," Miles finally said, his voice low but filled with regret. "She deserved better than what I gave her." Ryan looked up at him, his young face surprisingly steady. "She didn't hold grudges. She always said you were doing the best you could with what you knew." Miles's throat tightened, the boy's words piercing through the guilt he had carried. "She was wrong," he admitted. "I could have done more. Should have done more." Kneeling by the grave, Miles traced the edge of the headstone with his fingers. "Anna," he whispered as though she could hear him, "thank you for Ryan. For everything you gave him, even when I wasn't there to help. I won't let him down again." Ryan watched silently, the quiet strength of his presence a testament to the resilience his mother had instilled in him. After a moment, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph, the one that had led him to Miles. "I think she knew you'd come around," Ryan said, handing it to Miles. "That's why she gave me this." Miles took the photo, his fingers brushing the edges worn smooth by time. He felt a pang of sorrow but also a sense of gratitude. This photograph had bridged the gap between his old life and the new one. It had brought him his son. "Thank you for keeping this safe," Miles said, his voice thick. "And thank you for believing in me, even when I didn't deserve it." Ryan smiled softly, the moment filled with quiet understanding. "We both got a second chance." Weeks later, the transformation in their lives was undeniable. Miles and Ryan stood together in front of a sprawling green park, where laughter from children filled the air. It was a charity event, one Miles had organized to support underprivileged families in the city. Ryan adjusted the sleeves of his new jacket, fidgeting slightly. "Do I really have to make a speech?" he asked, looking up at Miles nervously. "You'll do great," Miles assured him, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. "Just tell your story. People need to hear it." Taking a deep breath, Ryan stepped up to the small podium. The crowd quieted as he began to speak. "When I was living on the streets, I didn't think people like you noticed kids like me," he said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "But someone gave me a chance. Now, I want to help others the way I was helped." Miles watched with pride as Ryan continued, his words resonating with the audience. The boy had grown in ways neither of them could have imagined. His resilience and newfound confidence were inspiring not just to Miles, but to everyone listening. After the applause died down, Ryan returned to Miles's side, a triumphant smile on his face. "How'd I do?" "You nailed it," Miles said, ruffling his hair affectionately. "You've got a knack for this." The event wrapped up with Miles pledging funds to support housing and education for children in need. Ryan's idea to focus on helping kids like himself had sparked a new passion in Miles, one that gave his wealth a purpose beyond mere accumulation. As they walked home together, Ryan turned to Miles with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think Mom would have liked this? What we're doing?" Miles smiled, his gaze softening. "I think she'd be proud. Of both of us." Ryan nodded, a peacefulness settling over him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he had to carry the weight of the world alone. He had a home, a future, and someone who believed in him. As they reached the front door, Miles paused. "You ready for this next chapter?" Ryan grinned, the kind of grin that spoke of hope and a new beginning. "Yeah. Let's do it." And together they stepped forward, father and son, a family born not just of blood but of choice and love.